Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. In today's episode, we'll be learning all about gold and what its role is in the economy and financial markets. Guiding us in this topic today is our expert, Saul Eslake. In 2016, Saul was appointed as the University of Tasmania's inaugural Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. Saul is also an independent consulting economist and has worked as an economist in the Australian financial markets for 25 years, including 14 years as Chief Economist at the Australia and New Zealand Banking Group, ANZ. After leaving ANZ in mid-2009, Saul was director of the Productivity Growth Program at the Grattan Institute, a non-aligned public policy think tank affiliated with the University of Melbourne. Saul is currently a member of the Parliamentary Budget Office's Expert Advisory Panel and of the Australian Taxation Office's Tax Gap Expert Panel. He is also chair of the CSIRO's Decadal Climate Forecasting Project Advisory Board. So with this wealth of knowledge, I'm excited to have Saul here guiding us for our discussion today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah. It's nice to be with you and looking forward to this conversation.
Of course, me too. And throughout your career, it's very obvious when I looked into you that you've held and continue to hold a number of esteemed positions, which if I were continued to reading a longer version of your bio, I think we would be here for quite some time. So I'd rather hear about it in your own words. Can you tell us a bit about your background and what compelled you to pursue economics?
Well, I came to economics by a process of elimination, to be honest with you. That is, I was one of these kids who was absolutely no good at sport. I had no capacity to figure out where a ball was and put a stick next to it, whether the ball was moving or stationary. I wasn't a particularly good runner or any other kind of athlete. But I wasn't the best in my class, but I was better than the average at most of the academic subjects. I didn't want to do the things that so-called bright kids were meant to want to do, like medicine or law. I didn't want to do anything that meant you had to leave Tasmania, where I grew up, in order to do it at what we would call a mainland university, because I finished year 12 before my 17th birthday and thought I was too young to be going away living independently. If I'd done at university what were my favourite subjects at year 11 and 12, which would have been history and geography, I might have done those. But I had trouble persuading myself or my parents that they would lead to a successful, remunerative career with secure employment. And it sort of came down to a choice between engineering and accountancy or commerce. And I didn't do engineering partly because you had to be really good at maths to do engineering. And although I'd passed maths in year 11 and 12, it certainly hadn't been my best subject. So I wouldn't claim to be particularly good at advanced maths. And someone else to whom I'd come second every year since grade 6 was doing engineering. And I didn't want to have another 4 years of doing that and having me going home and having my father ask me, so did you beat this guy this year? And the answer always being no. So I did commerce expecting that I'd be an accountant because I knew what accountants did. And so I enrolled in first year, and you had to do some economic subjects as well as some accounting or commerce subjects. And I found the economics ones much more interesting than the accounting or commerce ones. So at the end of first year, I switched my major to doing economics. Partway through third year, I got a cadetship from the Federal Treasury, which paid for me to do fourth year and also solved the problem of what was I going to do at the end of it, because it came with a job, admittedly in Canberra, but nonetheless, it came with a job at the end of it. So that answered my parents' questions as to, well, what are you going to do with this degree? And, in a sense, although I didn't particularly enjoy living in Canberra for the 3 years I did after I finished my degree, nonetheless, I've never really looked back at or regretted the choice of having done economics as a subject. And, it's been good to me, I suppose, career wise. I've had interesting and, by community standards, well paid jobs. And finally, I've been able to do my own thing for the last 10 years, operating out of my home state of Tasmania. And I think, well, how lucky am I to be able to do something that I really enjoy doing, get paid a reasonable amount for doing it, and be able to do it from where I want to live.
Yeah, that's the dream, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an amazing journey. Thank you for sharing all of that. And to dive into our topic a bit more for today, just as an introduction, what is the most common misconception that you've heard about gold?
Some people would disagree with me in saying this, but gold is held by many people to be a hedge against inflation. That is to say, when the prices of everything are rising significantly, many people think that holding gold protects them against inflation. And, in one sense, it does, because yes, the gold price does typically rise when inflation is higher than central banks and people at large want it to be. But sometimes the gold price goes up when there's no sign of inflation at all. And for example, that happened during and for quite some time after the global financial crisis of 2008-9, that some people were saying that what central banks were doing at that stage, electronically printing money, was going to cause inflation and the financial system was going to collapse again. There would be rampant inflation, and so you should buy gold. Well, that didn't happen on that occasion, and yet the gold price went up. I actually think that what gold is a hedge against is currency depreciation. That is a fall in the value of the currency of the country you happen to live in against other currencies, normally the US dollar, but other currencies as well. And I think gold is a very good hedge against depreciation of your own currency. If your own currency isn't the US dollar, given that the US dollar has traditionally been the unit of exchange for other currencies. In other words, we quote whether we're talking about the Australian or New Zealand dollars or the euro or the Norwegian krona or the Brazilian real or the Indonesian rupiah, it's normally quoted against the US dollar. So if the gold price is steady in US dollars, it's going up against your currency if your currency is going down. But as we've observed more recently, it's also a hedge against the US dollar going down. And I think that's the point, is that gold is a hedge against bad economic policies being pursued by the government of your country. One uh, one consequence of which may well be higher inflation, but not necessarily. It could also be, and often is, a depreciation of your exchange rate, because people in other countries recognize that your government is doing something stupid and pull their money out or don't invest it in. And that's reflected in the depreciation of the value of your currency. And gold has, throughout recorded human history, been a hedge against bad government.
Mm. Yeah, that's a fantastic introduction for our topic, and I'm looking forward to getting more into it. But before we do, we just want to get to know you a little better. So I've got a few more casual questions for you. First of all, do you have a favorite book?
Um, oh goodness, there are lots of them that come and go through time. I mean, as an economist, I'd have to say, although I didn't read many of them when I was doing my degree, unless they were prescribed reading for exams or assignments, since I did graduate, which was 1979, a surprisingly long time ago, books by some of the great economists, including John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, who come at economics from very different perspectives, but getting a wide range of perspectives has always been a good thing. More recently, the work of economists like Paul Krugman and Barry Eichengreen and so forth, I found very useful just in my normal professional work, or some of the memoirs of people like Ben Bernanke and Mervyn King, who've been governors of their country's central banks, have been instructive. So that's kind of professional work. I'm not a great reader of fiction unless it's by Tasmanian authors or set in Tasmania or set in places like Tasmania, such as Newfoundland. I'd be surprised if anyone watching this has heard of the Newfoundland trilogy by Wayne Johnson, but they are a series of books partly based on the life of someone who was the Premier of Newfoundland between 1949 and 1972 and the relationship he had with a journalist who was a fictional character. But they're wonderful stories. And then, I'm an avid reader of the history of a whole range of different countries, whether it's my own country, Australia, or the United States or Britain. But also I found Chinese, Russian, Japanese history to be fascinating. And, my library's got a lot of books of those on there, lots of those that have been interesting reading. I'm not sure I could nominate a favorite, but they're the sort of things that I read for pleasure and relaxation.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I guess similarly, do you have a movie that you've enjoyed recently?
Um, Well, one of my favorites was the shipping news because it was set in Newfoundland. Um, and I also was, in the 1980s, a great fan of Out of Africa and other movies that Meryl Streep was in. There haven't been a lot of movies in the last 10 years that have left a lasting impression on me, but some of those were among my favorites.
Yeah, amazing. And are you an avid podcast listener? Have you listened to any podcasts at the moment?
Um, yeah, to be honest with you, I don't listen to a lot. I prefer to read. Maybe
Yeah.
that's my age. I know most younger people prefer to watch videos or listen to audio. I don't drive to work. I work from home. So a lot of people listen to podcasts in their car or while they're on the bus or the tram or the train. I don't need to do that. So I prefer to read. I absorb what people are writing. I absorb wisdom. I learn from reading and highlighting, using what we used to do, using the yellow pen on a piece of paper, the highlighter pen. Now, of course, you can do that on a screen. So I tend to read. And quite often I'll read the transcript of a podcast rather than listen to the podcast if, they have AI or some kind of transcription service doing that. Of late, I've certainly been listening to some of the podcasts that magazines I read regularly, such as The Economist or The Atlantic, put out. Paul Krugman who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, has some very interesting podcasts that he puts on Substack, as does another economist called Claudia Sam, who used to work for the Federal Reserve. She does some very good ones. But as I say, my preference when I want to learn from someone who knows more about something than I do, and that's quite a big subset of humanity, I prefer to read.
Yeah, of course. I actually had somebody say something similar recently that I was interviewing where they said they didn't drive very long distances, so it was hard to listen to podcasts. So,
But
yeah.
Sarah, I think it's also a generational thing that,
Yeah,
and,
fair
and it's
enough.
not a criticism. I'm not trying to be an aging baby boomer saying, yeah, when I was a boy, we did this and young people should learn from that. It's just different experiences. As I say, I prefer to read, but I acknowledge that a lot of younger people prefer to look and listen.
Yeah, of course. Makes total sense. My next question for you is, do you have a role model? This could be either personally or professionally.
Oh, there are people who have done similar jobs to me before I did them, who have been, kind of role models for what I want to do. My very first boss as an economist in the private sector, Russell Barnes, was someone from whom I learned a lot. One of the first people to be the chief economist of a financial services firm in Australia was Don Stemmer, who's now long since retired, but he kind of wrote the manual for being an economist in financial institutions. So there are people like that. There are some overseas. Neil Soss, who was the chief economist for First Boston, is another one that I look at as an exemplar of the kind of role that I would like to play. For myself, however, I've always been someone who wants to speak my mind. If I had been someone who was capable of saying things I don't believe and not saying things I do believe, I might have gone into politics, where that's a requirement to be a successful politician in a party system. You have to be willing to say things you don't believe from time to time and restrain yourself from saying things you do believe. I've never been able to do that. Likewise, on 3 occasions during my career, when I found myself working for or with people I don't like and don't respect, you think to yourself, well, you either leave at a time and in circumstances of your choosing, or you end up leaving at a time and in circumstances of their choosing. And once you come to realize that, it's pretty obvious what you got to do. That's happened to me 3 times in my career. And, I've, it's not something I enjoy relating. You'd rather not be in that position. You would rather be working with people that you like, respect, admire, and whose company you enjoy. And, most of my career that's been the case, but on 3 occasions it hasn't. And on those I've taken matters into my own hands. But I think I've always thought that the greatest value I can add to the clients of whoever I've been working for when I've been on a big company's payroll, and certainly more recently when I've been working for myself, is to tell people what I honestly think.
Mm, yeah, definitely. That's a great answer. And finally, is there a class or a course that you've taken that has inspired you?
Well, I guess in the end, the economic subjects I did during my undergraduate degree were taught me things that I've used throughout my career. Different. Not everything you learn at university is stuff that you use. There were subjects I did that I might have made use of if I'd chosen a different career path. But there are things that I learned in my university degree that have remained with me. There are lots of things I picked up from reading the work of others that that I've taken into how I think, what I write, what I say. I wouldn't want to single out any one as being particularly important. There's lots of.
Yeah, amazing. Well, that was a great introduction to you as a person, and we're going to dive now into our more complex questions. But firstly, let's get some definitions out of the way. So, for starters, how would you define affluence?
Um, Not having to worry about where your next meal, your not having to worry about where your next meal is coming from, not having to worry about whether you're going to be thrown out of your home by your landlord, not having to worry about how you're going to live in retirement. Basically, not having money worries. Now, that's not the same thing as being happy. To be sure, there's absolutely nothing that says having sitting metaphorically on a pile of money is going to bring you happiness. Sometimes it can be the reverse. But affluence, I would describe as not having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. Yeah, in the broadest possible sense of that term.
Would you call it some level of like financial freedom? Is that a term we could use?
Yes, you could. I mean, I suppose it's being affluent is, and I've again, I found myself in this position is being able to walk away from a situation where you're working with people that you don't like and don't respect, knowing that that might mean you're going without income for a while, or that you're going to be earning a lesser income. I mean, to be quite specific, I left the last job I had working for a Wall Street investment bank after they started censoring what I was writing and saying that I couldn't speak at a conference about tax reform. Now, you don't lightly walk away from the salaries that Wall Street investment banks pay, but when I did that, I more than halved my income, but I was in a position where I could afford to do that. If I had been at that stage in my 30s, with a mortgage and a need to save up for my retirement, I might have had to suck up being censored and being told what I couldn't say or where I couldn't say it. But because I was, in the sense I've described it before, affluent, I could afford to make that kind of choice. So uh, I think you're right to say it's a form of freedom, which
Yeah.
not everybody has.
Yes, it seems very situation based.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it does make a lot
I
of
mean,
sense.
and,
Yeah.
trying to think broadly about this, someone with $100,000 in the bank wouldn't be considered rich or affluent in this country. But if you were in, more than half of the other countries around the world, you'd be one of the richest people around. So, to use your phrase, it's very situational as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And secondly, could you explain gold and what it represents for somebody who knows nothing about it, basically?
Well, I think the simplest way to think about it is that it is a store of value. It is something that someone else will pay something if you want to sell it to them. Now, that value is not constant, but it's something that, unlike paper money, can't be devalued by a government. It's something that, unlike a share in a company, doesn't carry any risk that the company will go insolvent. So, in that sense, it is a store of value that people regard as having safer characteristics than many other forms of investment. Of course, governments can confiscate it. Someone could steal it from you, in the same way that someone could steal cash that you put under your bed. Um, no asset is completely safe from confiscation by governments or theft, especially if you live in a lawless society or one which is a dictatorship where governments think that they can confiscate the assets. In days gone by, for much of recorded human history, it was a means of carrying out transactions. You could use gold to buy things, often because gold was minted into coins, which had different value, and so particularly for more valuable things, it was what economists call a means of transactions, as well as a store of value or a unit of account. But in today's modern world, the main role of gold is as a store of value. And when I say that, it's a store of value for individuals. It's a store of value for central banks, who are the fulcrum of the financial system of almost every economy, whether it's an advanced one like the United States, Germany, Japan, or Australia, or a developing one like Brazil or Nigeria or South Africa. Central banks hold part of their reserves in gold, partly to protect themselves, partly in order to, as a way of trying to assure the public at large that the currency, which is in part backed by gold, is actually worth something.
Yeah. No, that's a great explanation for our topic today. And then in that case, how would you describe the relationship between gold and affluence?
Well, historically, and here, we're talking, and it's perhaps worth remembering that, the role of gold in this sense goes back as far as we know writing goes back, to, um, I'm not sure to describe ancient Babylon, and Sumer as the cradle of civilization, but, in the earliest known operations of um, Babylon and Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, gold played a role as a store of value and in some cases as a means of conducting transactions. Rulers, kings, pharaohs, emperors always regarded the possession of gold as being a symbol of their authority over their subjects. Um, Quite often, it would be part of the way in which the public finances were conducted. We know that from time to time, kings like Henry VIII would deliberately uh, water down's the wrong word. I'm just trying to think of what the right word is, but debase their currencies by, a gold coin that was supposedly worth £1. They might combine some lead or tin with it, pretend that it was £1, and, in a sense, therefore try and spend more money in things so that gold can be used for bad purposes as well as good by governments. But historically, that role as a store of value and occasionally as a means of transaction is one that it kind of goes back as far as we understand Homo sapiens almost.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's very interesting to me. I actually studied archaeology. So, hearing about the early civilizations, I certainly agree with you that gold is something that comes up very frequently in those kind of studies, along with other rare materials and things that make people look more affluent in the depictions that we
Right.
have.
And
So,
and perhaps in that context, of course, gold was sometimes a way of what economics calls conspicuous consumption. That is a way of showing other people how wealthy you are by having gold in your clothes or
absolutely.
in your jewelry. And that's one way of advertising your wealth, but also for the church, a way of having gold crosses or gold leaf on your roof, gold in government buildings and that sort of thing. I mean, to take an example of that, I suppose I worked for ANZ when their head office was on the corner of Queen and Collins Street in Melbourne. People who are watching this who live in Melbourne will know this. And in the ground floor of that building was something that used to be called the Gothic Bank. It was originally built during the gold rush era that made Melbourne one of the richest cities in the world in the second half of the 19th century. And I remember being told that there was a ton of gold leaf in the roof of the Gothic banking chamber on the corner of Collins and Elizabeth Streets in Melbourne. I mean, that was a way of it wasn't ANZ in those days. I think it was the Union Bank of Australasia that was founded in 1851. That was a way of the Union Bank demonstrating to its customers and potential customers that it was a sound financial institution in which people could entrust their savings and be confident in doing business with. So, in a sense, I suppose gold was a form of advertising, both for individuals and for businesses. And likewise, banks would hold gold in their in their safes, as partly because people would want to store gold in there, and the bank would provide that service. Central banks, as I mentioned before, would hold tons of gold, as a way of demonstrating their financial soundness and assuring the public at large that the currency, the paper money which they issued, was actually worth what it was printed on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've kind of talked about the past. What has the economic role of gold been in the past as opposed to now, and how has it changed a bit?
Well, for quite a long time, from I think 1715 until the Second World War, the world's major currencies were fixed in terms of gold. I think this
Okay.
began with Sir Isaac Newton, the physicist that people will remember, who invented laws of gravity and that sort of thing. He was also the controller of the Royal Mint. And he prescribed that the British pound, which in those days was the world's most important currency, would be fixed in terms of gold. That anyone who had a pound note or a £10 note, would have the right to go to the mint and exchange that for a fixed amount of gold. And for as long as Britain was the world's most important currency, which it was up until the First World War, other countries' currencies would be expressed either in terms of pounds sterling or in terms of gold. And then after the First World War, which sent Britain and other European countries close to bankruptcy and left the United States, in a dominant position, gradually the world's financial capital moved from London to New York, and the US dollar became increasingly important as the world's currency. Principal currency, and that was especially so after 1945, up to the end of the Second World War. But during that period, and especially during the Great Depression, countries attempted to hold the value of their currency fixed to gold, even though during the First World War and afterwards they'd experienced massive inflation. So, to pick one well-known example, in 1926, Winston Churchill, who at the time was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is what the British call the Treasurer, we call in Australia, he was advised badly to return the exchange rate for the British pound to what it had been in 1914. despite the fact that Britain had experienced massive inflation during and after the First World War, which meant that, in fact, a pound was worth less in terms of the goods that it could buy than it had been in 1914. But Churchill put the pound back onto the gold standard, as it was called, and that helped bring on what became known to history as the Great Depression. Most people think the Great Depression started with the stock market crash in New York on, I think, the 29th of October 1929. And that was certainly a pivotal event in bringing the Great Depression to the United States. And relevantly, in today's world, it was compounded by the enormous increase in tariffs called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that were imposed in 1930. You know, those tariffs helped put the into the Great Depression. But it started in Europe earlier than that, in part because governments, in particular Britain's, tried to undo history and put their currency back on what was called the gold standard. The beginning of the end of the Great Depression in the United States came when President Franklin Roosevelt devalued the US dollar from what had been 23 US dollars an ounce to 35 US dollars an ounce. And that helped put an end to the deflation that had been occurring in the United States from the great crash on Wall Street in October 29 through to about 1933. And then through the rest of the 1930s, through the Second World War, and for about 27 years after the Second World War, under what was known as the Bretton Woods scheme, after a small town or a hotel in New Hampshire, where the British and the Americans basically determined what the post-war monetary system would be, motivated by a desire to avoid repeating the breakdown of the global financial system in the 1920s and 30s that had helped precipitate the Great Depression. They agreed that currencies would be fixed to the US dollar, and that the US dollar would in turn be fixed at 35 US dollars an ounce. So that became known as the so-called gold exchange standard. That broke down in the 1970s, in 1972, when President Richard Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard, basically said, we're not going to promise to pay anyone who presents a US dollar at the Federal Reserve that they'll get 35 US dollars. That in turn was the result of the inflationary consequences of the way the United States had pursued both the Vietnam War and what President L.D. Johnson called the Great Society, the expansion of welfare programs in the United States in the 1960s, became economically incompatible with a fixed exchange rate. And so the first big surge in the price of gold came after the end of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates in the early 1970s. And ever since then, including during the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors in 1973-4, and again in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then with the Gulf War in the early 1990s, whenever there's been heightened geopolitical tension or economic uncertainty, the gold prices tended to rise against the US dollar. When individual countries have found themselves living with the consequences of bad government policies and their own currencies have been depreciating, then the gold price has gone up then. And, we've seen another instance of that, I think, in the aftermath of Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine and Crimea in 2014-15, resulted in Western countries imposing sanctions on Russia. And from that moment, the Chinese noted that Western countries had imposed financial sanctions on Russia. And they started switching their foreign exchange reserves, which they'd been accumulating massively in order to prevent their currency, the renminbi, from going up, as it would otherwise do if you're running large current account surpluses, as China was doing. They started accumulating gold instead of US dollars. And that got a further dimension in 2022, after Putin's second invasion of Ukraine in February of that year, when, to Putin's surprise, it wasn't just the United States that imposed tougher sanctions on Russia, but also other countries where Russia had been parking reserves in the belief that other Western countries wouldn't join with the US, such as Britain, Other European countries, Germany, Switzerland, and Japan, all of them joined the United States in imposing much tougher sanctions on Russia after the second invasion of Ukraine. And the Chinese noticed that again. And I think one of the reasons for the steady increase in gold over the last 3 years has been that China, which obviously is now acutely conscious that if they ever decide to make a grab for Taiwan, they will be subject to Western sanctions, but also other emerging economies who, for different reasons, don't want to be solely reliant on the United States or vulnerable to Western sanctions, have increasingly been accumulating reserves in gold. And that has been a factor driving the gold price up. And then just in the last 3 or 4 weeks before we're having this conversation, you've seen something very unusual, which is that in the face of heightened political uncertainty, caused by not just the tariffs that the Trump regime has been imposing, but the chaotic, if not anarchic way in which they've been imposing them, has prompted something very unusual, which is that in the face of heightened uncertainty, the US dollar has gone down and US bond yields have gone up. Now, that hasn't happened since the Second World War, because whenever markets have been uncertain, have been nervous, even if the US itself has been the cause of the nervousness, as it was during the global financial crisis, or to some extent as it was during COVID, the US dollar has nonetheless been seen as a safe haven, and US government bonds have been seen as a safe asset because no one ever thinks the US would default on its debt. So normally during periods of uncertainty, when people want to sell shares, sell other currencies, sell other government bonds, usually they put their money in US dollars and put those US dollars in US government bonds. But during this most recent episode, triggered by Trump's ludicrous announcement of tariffs, including on the penguins in Heard and McDonald Islands, among others, and the crazy way in which those tariffs were calculated, there has clearly been an erosion of trust in the United States and its financial assets as a safe haven. And then, if you're an investor who's worried about that, you say, well, where are you going to put your money? You can put some of it in Swiss francs if you like, but Switzerland is a pretty small economy. And the Swiss themselves don't want to be flooded with capital that pushes their exchange rate up. So the only other alternative really is gold. And that is, I think, it's the fact that the gold price has in the last couple of weeks gone up to $3,400 an ounce or higher is actually a sign that the US dollar is losing some of the status which it has enjoyed since 1945. There's no other currency that is capable of playing that role at the moment. The only other asset is the one that has been a store of value since, as we were saying before, the days of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, and that's gold. That's telling you something about the heightened uncertainty that not just businesses and consumers, but investors around the world are feeling.
Yeah. Wow, that is a fantastic history to contextualize what we've been talking about, and right up until today as well. Has there been a particular point in time where the behavior of gold prices has surprised you? Would you say the most surprising thing is what's happening today, as you were saying?
Well, yes, I would, because for most of recorded history, the price of gold has been fixed by governments, and governments have pledged to do things that would ensure that the currency remained fixed in terms of gold. When countries were on the gold standard, as Britain in particular was from 1715 until 1931 when they broke with gold, but then they went back onto it with the establishment of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1945 until 1970. That's an enormous piece of recorded human history that, what are we talking about, almost 300 years. Governments would do things typically to ensure that the price of gold remained fixed. And if they didn't, there would be a financial crisis. And there would be other places, in the last 80 years, the United States, in which to invest. And so right up until 1972, when the Bretton Woods system broke down, the price of gold was reasonably stable, expressed in terms of whichever was the dominant currency in the world, the pound sterling, up until the end of World War I, and then during the interwar period, and particularly after World War II, the US dollar. But what we've seen in the period since then, the spikes in gold during periods of heightened uncertainty about the potential for geopolitical conflict, or during heightened periods of uncertainty about economic policies, such as the global financial crisis during COVID, and now with all the madness that's happening in Washington, D.C., these are when the gold prices surge. But as I said, the fact that the US dollar is going down and US bond yields are going up during a period of heightened political uncertainty is the first time that's happened, since at least 1945. It's really very significant.
Wow. Yeah, that is really fascinating that this is such a significant moment in time. So it's a great time to have you on the podcast to explain it to everyone as well. So, in this case, how would you compare the behavior of gold in a portfolio compared to other commodities or assets?
Well, when you're looking at gold from an investment portfolio point of view, one of the things you have to bear in mind is that it doesn't produce any return. Gold doesn't pay interest like bonds or bank deposits. It doesn't pay dividends like shares do. In that sense, I suppose it's a bit like copper or iron ore or tin. It only produces a return for you as an investor if it goes up in price. Now, we've been talking about the circumstances in which it does go up in price. They are, first of all, often, though not always, if inflation is unacceptably high. Second, if your own government is pursuing bad economic policies that result in a loss of faith on the part of both domestic and foreign investors that sees your currency going down. And third, during periods of heightened worldwide geopolitical uncertainty, and as we're seeing now, that uncertainty emanating from what is meant to be, the financial capital of the world's biggest economy, a country that you can normally trust to do the right thing. All of which has been cast into doubt since the 20th of January 2025, when Donald Trump got back into the White House. So an ordinary investor would only hold any material amount of gold in his or her portfolio if they thought that one of those three things was going to happen, that inflation was going to rise and be persistent for a while. You wouldn't hold gold in your portfolio if you thought inflation was going to go high for 6 months and then come back again. It wouldn't be worth the trouble. If you thought your government was pursuing policies that would lead your exchange rate to crash, you might well hold quite a bit in gold, because although it's not paying you return, at least the value of it isn't going down and it might actually be going up. Or if you thought that the world as a whole was going to hell in a handbasket, you might well want to put money in gold. Now, you don't obviously necessarily have to hold gold physically yourself. Put gold bars in your cellar if you have one, or hide them under a bed. There are obviously risks that if someone finds out about that, they could relieve you of them. But you can buy exchange traded funds that are linked to gold, or although there are some risks in doing this, you could buy shares in gold mining companies, although you're obviously subject to the risks associated with the equity market, which gold is sometimes meant to be a hedge against. But in that sense, gold plays a role in an investment portfolio as a hedge against bad things happening.
Right. That makes sense. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'd like to move on now to our practices and habits segment. My question for you here is, what habit would you recommend someone practicing if they want to learn more about gold and about the market?
Read widely,
Mm,
including reading things that you might not agree with, that challenge your thinking. And if you think about an argument put by someone that you find contradicts your long-held beliefs, well, you might actually learn something from it, or you might come away with greater confidence that your beliefs are correct. But I think read widely, uh, be disciplined about observing what is happening, with the gold price. Look at it each morning, read why people's explanations as to why it has moved in whatever direction it has. Try and build up in your own mind a picture of the things that do influence the gold price, so that you can perhaps get ahead of what other people are thinking. Because you don't make money buying something, whether it's gold, shares, or bonds, after the fact. after the market has already priced something in, you're not going to make money by doing it after everybody else has done. You've got to do it before people do. And, likewise, as the price of gold were to go down, which it does from time to time, it's not a one-way bet, then, you need to have in your mind, in your toolkit, what are the things that historically have caused the gold price to go down? Do I see any of those things starting to happen? Is there any reason to think that they might start to happen? Well, maybe I should be reducing my holding. Or conversely, if you don't have any and you have a good idea based on your reading and your research of things that usually result in the gold price going up, am I seeing any of those things happening? Are there clouds on the horizon that my reading of history tells me might result in a spike in the gold price? You kind of you've got to get ahead of the herd in order to be financially successful.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I know you're a professional who works in this field a lot, but do you ever find that there's challenges with doing this reading and really reading
Well,
widely?
yes, there can be. And, to be very honest with you, probably one of the smartest financial decisions I ever made was to contract out all of my investments to, professional fund managers about 25 years ago. Because, I knew from my own experience that I found it difficult to be disciplined to be watching those kind of things, whether it was individual company results or the movements in individual commodities, because there was too much other interesting economic stuff going on, and I was much more interested in that. So, in some ways, one of the most important things to know is to know what you don't know. And then if you're not prepared to put the effort in yourself to knowing what you need to know, hand that over to someone who does know and
Yeah.
has demonstrated the capacity to know it probably more quicker than you do. So, it does require some, I think, particular characteristics, and and not everyone has them. And if you don't personally have them, but you want to play around in this space, maybe, kind of hiring someone to do it for you who has a good track record is better than kidding yourself that you're going to be any good at it.
Yeah. That's great advice. And I'd like to now move on to our open mic segment. So, this is basically your chance to talk about anything you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to the topic or discussion so far, but it can be because that's probably what you are passionate about anyway. You can promote anything you like in this section. So, the floor is yours.
Well, Sarah, I'm passionate about good economic policy and about bad economic policy. I thought about mentioning this earlier when you were asking me why I did economics. One of the people who won a Nobel Prize in economics, James Tobin, who is probably best remembered for inventing what we call modern portfolio theory, which can be summarized as saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. James Tobin said he studied economics out of a belief that it could result in the betterment of mankind. That good economic policy pursued over a long period of time can make most people better off. It's important in that good economic policy is not just about promoting efficiency. It also involves considerations of equity or fairness. That is to say, not only is it important to grow the pie, as it were, but it's also important to ensure that the pie is carved up fairly. And one of the failings of modern economics and modern economists is that they haven't paid enough attention to distributional questions. And one of the reasons for the rise of people like Donald Trump is that it's a reaction on the part of some people to what they perceive as being unfair. And, I think people are going to find out that Donald Trump isn't going to do anything to solve that unfairness, but the underlying anger about unfairness has given rise to movements like Trump and Le Pen in France and Nigel Farage in the UK and the AfD in Germany and other things that we see like that. And there are historical precedents about that. So something I've talked about fairly passionately for 45 years is housing policy. I share the concern, even though going back to the discussion we had earlier about what affluence means, I've not had to worry about having a roof over my head. But I'm very conscious that a growing proportion of younger people, including my own kids who are 17 and 23, they're not going to find it as easy to put a roof over their head as it was for me or my parents. And, I've been trying to advocate since 1980 for governments to stop doing things that make the housing problem worse and to start doing things that might actually solve the problem. I think part of the reason they don't do it is that a majority of Australians don't want the problem to be solved, because we've got 11 million voters who own their own property. We've got 2.25 million who own at least one investment property. That's an awful lot more votes for policies that would keep house price inflation going upwards than there are 110,000 people a year who succeed in becoming first home buyers. Even if you assume that for every one who does, there are 5 or 6 who don't, that's only 750,000 votes for policies that might actually stop house price inflation. So, while politicians of all political stripes shed crocodile tears, especially at election times, for the difficulties faced by young people getting into the housing market, deep down they know that the overwhelming majority of voters don't care and don't want the problem to be solved. I've been kind of saying this sort of stuff for 45 years without actually making any change, but, I do care about good housing policy. I care about financial literacy, especially in a world where people are now bearing the risk that their investments don't turn out so well in terms of their retirement, whereas previously you got an age pension or you were in a defined benefit fund. That is, you retired and you got paid a pension if you were a white collar worker. Now, people have to bear the investment risk. While you're working and contributing to super, you hope your super is well managed. Then when you retire and you get your super, you kind of have to manage it, or you have to pay someone to manage it for you, so that as you live out to whenever it is that your time expires, you have money to live with dignity. So financial literacy. Sorry, my earphone, you can edit this bit out.
That's okay.
Financial literacy is enormously important. And while, schools try to impart financial literacy to kids in, year 10, year 11, year 12, there are an awful lot of people around, certainly in my state of Tasmania, who don't get to go to year 11 and 12, unfortunately. Getting people to understand the basics of investment and finance is something that, I try in my own way help people to do. That's important. My own kind of personal passions are more around things like travel. I've been to about 50 countries, either for work or for holidays. You always like experiencing different places, different cultures, learning about their history, what makes them who they are, is a kind of personal passion of mine. So there's a mixture of things that I think are important that I can make some small contribution to greater understanding of, and things that I just personally enjoy.
Yeah, amazing. I also think financial literacy is really important. And what you've said there about education is really important as well. It's so difficult to insert that kind of thing into, curriculums that are already very defined, and teachers don't necessarily have time to do that. So, and also thank you for speaking up about that you've advocated for housing policy. That's really interesting as well. So we're coming to the conclusion of our episode now. If our listeners want to find out more about you and your work, where should they go?
Well, I'd encourage them to go to my website, which is www.sauleslake.info. That's got lots of stuff I've written over the period of my time as an economist, but it's got recent radio and TV interviews, some podcasts. If you guys let me, I'll put a link to your one, this one, on my website. There's all that sort of thing. I have a LinkedIn page, which has comments on more contemporary issues. They're probably the best ways of finding out what I do.
Great. That's perfect. And we'll definitely put a link to your website in our show notes for this, and any other resources that you want to share with our audience, you can send through, and we'll get those all in the show notes for our listeners. So that is bringing us to the end of our episode today. Thank you so much for joining us. I've certainly learned a lot from you, so I hope our listeners have too. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you in the next episode.
Thanks, Sarah.
You've been listening to Wealth Pathways, the Affluence Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at affluence.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.